There are 100 different places to start talking about My Friend Pedro, from its unmatched style, excellent gunplay, and fun movement mechanics, but let's first start at Grand Theft Auto 5. The absolute clusterfuck of a multiplayer mode aside, GTA 5 is one of the most ambitious games ever made. The enormous budget, the relentless attention to detail, and the ability to change characters at any time set it apart from any open world game when it released in 2013. Although, what's often not talked about is how much the game emphasizes fun in its mission design. The first time a player assumes the role of Franklin, a poor hustler with less than $1,000 to his name, it would be assumed that players would be driving a car that could barely go the speed limit because that's what he could realistically afford. Instead, players are tasked with repossessing a sports car before being able to immediately race it through the streets of Los Santos. Alternatively, this mission where the three protagonists are tasked with kidnapping a VIP from a high-rise building. Players are first put in charge of flying a helicopter, before then swapping to the more exciting role of rappelling down a building, then finally to an overlooking sniper position. When things get messy, the developers have made such excellent use of having multiple characters, because the player can always be assuming the most exciting role. GTA 5 doesn't let the story get in the way of giving players an excuse to play out cool scenarios, and it's this mentality that makes the campaign consistently so fun. This is what is also at the forefront of My Friend Pedro. Players don't need to give a shit about the serviceable story or worry about top tier graphical fidelity, because just playing the game is more entertaining than anything else you'll do this week. Long-time viewers will know that I'm a sucker for shooters with a good movement system, and luckily, that's all this game is, and it's what it does so fucking well. The feeling of unloading a gun is just phenomenal. The sound design is on par with the best in the genre, and enemies are just as fun to murder in the late game as they are in the first 10 minutes. The game is only around 4 to 5 hours long, but roughly every hour, the player will get access to a new weapon, which always seem to be more fun than the last. Using a sniper rifle point blank while flipping around enemies is exactly as fun as it sounds. The weapons just complement the movement so well, as players will quickly find themselves rarely staying still, and always using jumps, dodges, and rolls to evade the AI. Combine this with zip lines, swings, and even skateboards, and once again, we see how the game is just begging the player to have as much fun as possible. My Friend Pedro never felt like a difficult game by any measure, but the difficulty is entirely dependent on a player's expectations of themselves. If a person wants to chase the high scorecards at the end of each mission, or speedrun the entire game in 90 minutes, then they're free to do so. Personally, I found it a perfect excuse to feel like John Wick and be entirely unstoppable for an afternoon. I was entirely content with my B tier scorecard when I was using a pan to ricochet bullets into bad guys, all to the approval of my supportive banana friend. This game is contrary to the frustration-inducing games that I can't stand, as the only punishment for dying is the effect on the scorecard. No bullshit loading screens or infuriating checkpoints. You just pick up exactly where you left off and get straight back into having a good time. And my fucking god, following in the steps of Payday 2 or Hotline Miami, this soundtrack could make your morbidly obese uncle want to run a marathon. There are of course a few downsides that are worth mentioning. The last third of the game, for example, seems to slow down somewhat, and the challenge shifts less from the super fun combat to dealing with more of the less interesting puzzles and traps. The puzzles are usually intuitive, and most involve more shooting, which is in itself redeeming, but personally, puzzles in any title will very rarely award the game any more of my praise. Your own mileage may vary. The enemies in the late game, however, do feel more bullet spongy, which does seem to slow down combat. Ideally, I would have simply liked more numerous, as opposed to tankier enemies. By the later stages of the game, Players rely more on the time slow mechanic, which isn't so necessary in earlier missions. Although, the ability to slow time is one of the greatest parts of this game, and the time that it can be used is extremely generous, meaning you never feel punished for relying on it when it's needed. My only criticism is the screen sometimes felt more distorted than needed when the scene was already filled with a dozen enemies, all trying to give me the big die. A feature that I think should be standard for games that make use of a time slow mechanic is a replay system that isn't affected by the time changes. Watching a replay after every level of Superhot, for example, made this a sorely missed addition to a game that would benefit so much from highlighting these incredible moments. My Friend Pedro is one of the shortest games a player can buy. It shares a belief that making something longer, simply for the sake of it being longer, will very rarely make the product any better. This game will be over at around the same time you start becoming competent at playing, but for the 24 Australian dollars I paid, it was worth every cent. By the end of the year, when this is selling for $10 in a Steam sale, it would be good to compare this to the 5 loot box alternative that is guaranteed to never bring as much joy as this tiny, polished, and wonderfully enjoyable game.